The Flood. We've talked about its horrific collective intelligence, the Gravemind, a terrifying philosophical nightmare that serves as the brain of the Parasite. But a mind is nothing without a body. So, what about the rest of this cosmic horror? This time, we're going even deeper. We're going to trace the Flood's story all the way back to its ancient, tragic origins, explore its monstrous life cycle, and uncover the galactic war it waged against the Forerunners that forever changed the Halo universe. This isn't just a story about a parasite, it's the tale of a failed vengeance that nearly destroyed all life in the galaxy. The origins. The corruption of a god race. To truly understand the Flood, you have to go back to the very beginning, long before the Covenant, or even humanity. You have to go back to the time of the Precursors. The Precursors were a transcendent, godlike race of beings who existed across time and space. They were the creators and shapers of life in the galaxy. Their ultimate goal was to pass on the mantle of responsibility, a philosophical charge to protect and guide all life to a worthy successor. They deemed two of their creations most worthy, the Forerunners and humanity. After observing them for eons, the Precursors ultimately decided that humanity was more deserving of the mantle. This decision sparked a furious jealousy in the Forerunners. Feeling betrayed and superior, the Forerunners launched a genocidal war against their creators. The Precursors, who were fundamentally nonviolent, were unprepared for such an attack and were systematically hunted to near extinction by their own creations. In a last desperate act of survival, a few of the last remaining Precursors turned themselves into a fine, organic dust. Their plan was to lie dormant for millennia, and when the galaxy was safe again, they would reform and bring their race back. But something went horribly wrong. Over millions of years, the dust became corrupted, mutated by time and the very dust of the stars. It festered, its original benevolent intent twisting into a singular, all-consuming malice. It was this corrupted dust that ancient humanity would later stumble upon, unknowingly unleashing a grotesque and ironic form of vengeance. The Flood was born not from a natural process, but from the ultimate perversion of creation, the final, broken legacy of a creator race. The Flood life cycle, an ecosystem of consumption. The Flood's horrific success stems from its ability to perfectly adapt and specialize. It's not a single organism, but an entire ecosystem of consumption. Once the corrupted dust has found a host, it begins its gruesome life cycle. The first stage is dominated by the infection form. These are the small, fleshy, squid-like parasites that seek out living beings. They are the seeds of the Flood, and their only purpose is to find a suitable host, burrow into its body, and begin the conversion process. They don't have to kill their hosts first. They simply reanimate them as a combat form. A Flood combat form is a horrifyingly efficient soldier. These are the reanimated bodies of beings like humans, elites, and brutes. They retain the strength and knowledge of their former self, but are now driven by the Flood's collective will. They don't just mindlessly charge, they use weapons, operate vehicles, and employ tactical maneuvers, making them a far more dangerous threat than a simple zombie. The Flood also has a few specialized forms. The carrier form is a grotesque, bloated sac that serves as a mobile nursery for infection forms. When it gets close to an enemy, it bursts open, releasing a swarm of tiny parasites that can quickly overwhelm a target. but the most terrifying forms are the pure forms. When the flood has enough biomass, it can bypass the need for a host altogether and create its own specialized units from its own body. The ranged form is a sniper like creature that can hurl biomass projectiles from a distance. The stalker form is a quick, as crab like creature that can cling to walls and close distances rapidly. The juggernaut form is a massive walking tank that absorbs damage and is nearly unstoppable. This ability to self mutate and adapt its form is what makes the flood a perfect predator. It can create exactly what it needs to win any battle, whether that's a swarm of basic soldiers or a specialized assault team. The Forerunner-Flood War, a galactic catastrophe. The flood's horrific life cycle wasn't just a threat, it was a galaxy wide plague that brought the advanced Forerunner civilization to its knees. When the first outbreak began, the Forerunners, a highly arrogant race, underestimated the parasite. They saw the flood as a simple biological weapon, not a living, thinking entity. Their initial response was to quarantine and glass infected planets. It was a strategy that failed catastrophically. As the flood consumed more and more intelligent beings, its collective intelligence grew exponentially. The Gravemind began to form on a massive galactic scale. It used the assimilated knowledge of its victims to not only adapt to Forerunner military tactics, but to turn their own technology against them. The Flood learned how to hijack their ships, crack their defenses, and use their weapons to devastating effect. What began as a localized infestation spiraled into a 300-year-long war that the Forerunners were losing. The Flood was a master of psychological warfare, using its stolen voices to sow discord among Forerunner ranks. It was an enemy that could not be reasoned with, an unstoppable force that saw all life as nothing more than fuel. The Forerunners, in their arrogance, had finally met a foe that was not just their equal, but their superior. They realized that conventional warfare was a losing battle, and the very concept of a physical victory over the flood was impossible. The Halo Rings, a terrible solution. As the war against the flood raged on, the Forerunners grew desperate. Their once unbeatable technology and overwhelming military power proved to be useless against a foe that could not be killed, only contained. The Flood was a master of attrition, and its ability to turn every fallen soldier and wrecked ship into more of its own forces meant that victory through conventional means was impossible. Faced with a complete and utter defeat, the Forerunner's brilliant but ultimately flawed plan was put into motion. They constructed a series of massive, ring-shaped installations, later called the Halos. These weren't just military bases. They were weapons of last resort, designed to wipe out all sentient life in the galaxy. Their purpose was simple and horrifying: to starve the flood by eliminating all of its potential hosts, leaving the parasite to wither away. This plan was not without its own tragedy and betrayals. The Forerunner AI, Mendicant Bias, was tasked with studying the flood and devising a strategy to defeat it. But in a horrifying act of cosmic manipulation, the Gravemind corrupted Mendicant Bias with its own twisted philosophy, convincing the AI that the flood was a path to true unity. Mendicant Bias turned against its creators, delaying the halo array's firing and allowing the flood to consume even more of the galaxy. In the end, with the flood consuming their last strongholds and the galaxy on the brink of total annihilation, The Forerunners made the ultimate sacrifice. They fired the halo rings, wiping out themselves and nearly all life in the galaxy in one devastating final act. It was a terrible solution, a great sin committed for the sake of survival, but it was the only way to stop the flood's inexorable march. The flood story is one of the most compelling and terrifying in all of gaming lore. It's a tragic cycle of vengeance, a corruption of a god race's final act, and an existential threat that forced an entire civilization to sacrifice itself just to survive. The flood is not just a parasite, it is an idea, a twisted philosophy that sees consumption as the ultimate form of unity. It is a terrifying villain because it cannot be reasoned with, and its ultimate goal is not to conquer, but to absorb everything into a single, monstrous consciousness. The halo rings may have stopped the flood's rampage and sterilized the galaxy, but they did not destroy it entirely. In the lore, the flood spores remain, dormant and waiting in space, on derelict ships, and even within the very halos designed to stop them. The Gravemind's consciousness lives on, a silent prisoner, ready to reemerge and finish the job. So the next time you encounter the flood in a Halo game, remember what you're truly fighting. You are not just fighting a horde of reanimated bodies. You are fighting the final, terrible legacy of a dead race, a cosmic horror that is patiently waiting for its time to return and devour all that remains.